bonsoir.
Bonsoir.
C'est un grand plaisir de vous avoir avec nous cet après-midi au sein d'un séminaire de recherche organisé par l'Institut des sciences humaines et sociales du Centre de recherche de l'Université d'Ioannina. L'initiative pour ce cycle de séminaires organisé par nos collègues repose sur la volonté des membres affiliés de l'Institut de regrouper, si vous voulez, des chercheurs mûrs et reconnus comme vous, avec de jeunes chercheurs qui sont en train de travailler sur des recherches, soit au sein de leur DEA, soit au sein de leur travail de recherche. Comme la plupart des auditeurs sont anglophones, je serais obligée, je dis obligée parce que ce serait vraiment un plaisir moi de continuer en français, mais je ne peux pas. Donc je dois abandonner une des rares occasions de pouvoir parler en français pour continuer en anglais. Donc I welcome you to the University of Ioannina and to the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences of the University of Ioannina for this third research webinar. And of course, I thank you for accepting this invitation. So along with you, as the main speaker for this afternoon, we have with us George Faraklás from Pandeio University and two philosophy graduate students, Mr. John Perperidis, who is a PhD candidate, and Ms. Irini Folina. Our first meeting, if I recall well, Corine, took place 4 years ago, that is in May 2016, in Athens at the French Institute of Athens, in the course of a very successful cultural event, La Nuit de la Philosophie. So back then, and I suppose this is worth saying, I already knew your work. I had with me your 2011 book on Éléments pour une éthique de la vulnérabilité, les hommes, les animaux, la nature. Donc, Elements for an Ethics of Vulnerability, the Humans, the Animals, Nature, aux éditions du CERF. And during our communication before leaving Athens, I asked you to sign my copy of the book. So I have it with me, it's right here. I have the French edition of Éléments pour une éthique de la vulnérabilité. And please allow me to share with everyone else this afternoon your dédicace in its first page. Donc, vous m'avez écrit cet essai dans lequel on peut voir que la vulnérabilité est aussi une force. That was what you wrote. So this essay in which one can see that vulnerability can also be a strength. Now, this short phrase kept its echo long after that spring meeting in Athens, as it had a very deep proximity to my own research concerns for the years to come. But I also think that this phrase condenses your own path of thought in a very explicit way. So as schematic as it can be, I think it's worthwhile to have a very, very brief outline of your career path in philosophy for our audience, especially for our students, grads and undergrads, who have been invited to follow this webinar. So as Evangelia just said, you're a professor of ethics and political philosophy, what we usually call in philosophy professor of practical philosophy, the Aristotelian term, at the Université Gustave Eiffel, which is the ex-Paris-Est Val-de-Marne University. Your bibliography comprises more than 12 books on moral philosophy, political philosophy, what we call applied ethics, especially bioethics, animal ethics, and environmental ethics, but also books on phenomenology, especially the phenomenological philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. And allow me to cite just a few of these books, which really have a very big, I would say, scope within philosophy, starting from your PhD thesis on Léo Strauss, Une autre raison, d'autres lumières, Essai sur la crise de la rationalité contemporaine, Leo Strauss, Another Reason, Another Enlightenment, Essay on the Crisis of Contemporary Rationality, Chevrin, in édition Vrin, 2005. 2005. This book is already translated in English, and I saw that the Chinese translation is in progress. Chinese, my God, Chinese translation. Okay. So second one, in 2009, L'autonomie brisée, bioéthique et philosophie. I don't know how to translate it, brisée in English. I really don't know. L'autonomie brisée. Broken autonomy, bioethics and philosophy. In 2009, La raison du sensible, entretien autour de la bioéthique, the reason of the sensible, conversations around bioethics. The book, which was the first book for myself to study as far as your work is concerned, Éléments pour une éthique de la vulnérabilité, 2011, which gained the Grand Prix Moron of the French Academy of Sciences, and it was already translated into Chinese. Already translated.
Yes, but it's late.
It's not completed yet. Yeah. Comment va Marianne? Conte philosophique et républicain, which is more of a novel than an essay. And then Tu ne tueras point, réflexion sur l'actualité de l'interdit de meurtre. La nourriture, a very important book of yours. La nourriture, philosophie du corps politique, en 2015. Translated into English, German and Japanese. Manifeste animaliste, politiser la cause animale, en 2017. Translated in Spanish, Italian, German, Korean, and there is a Turkish and Greek translation in progress.
Yeah.
Éthique de la considération, en 2018. Translated in German and Greek by George Faraklas. Pour comprendre Lévinas, 2020, a Greek translation in progress by you, once more, yeah. And Réparons le monde, humains, animaux, nature, which was also in 2020, and the book to come, let's say, Les Lumières à l'âge du vivant, which is for January 2001. Okay. In 2020, Professor Pelluchon obtained the prestigious Günther Anders Award for Critical Thinking, Günther Anders Preis für kritisches Denken. And just a few words on the main, let's say, points of his work, the focus of your work. So Corine Pelluchon's philosophy focuses on the multifaceted destiny of the Enlightenment project, I would say, starting from her 2003 doctoral research on Leo Strauss philosophy and his critique of modern liberal democracy, and from the mid-2000s on, through an intensive questioning of the anthropological and political challenges of biotechnologies, medical technologies, environmental and sanitary crisis, and also the acute awareness of the finitude of the planet and the interest of non-human agents such as animals, thus elaborating new forms of animal ethics and new forms of what she designates as virtue ethics. With this aim, Professor Pelluchon develops a post-metaphysical philosophy of corporeality based mainly on the phenomenology of Emmanuel Levinas, which stresses the relational dimension of the subject and paves the way for new approaches to ethics and politics on the grounds of a new integrated form of humanism. So Pelluchon's starting points is, I would say, the diagnosis of today's critical condition at an age which is best known as the age of the Anthropocene, where we're invited to reconsider old dichotomies such as those between nature and culture, subject and object, intellect and body, and thus to overcome the rigid dualisms which have dominated modernity in thought and action. Now, some of the issues raised by Professor Pelluchon in her numerous essays, papers, novels, and critical writings are the following. How could the recognition of our interdependence with animals, but also and above all of our common vulnerability, makes us want to inhabit Earth in a different manner, in a different way? How can we finally learn to coexist and meet the multiple ecological, climatic, health, economic, and ethical challenges, and to promote more justice towards others, be they humans, animals, or nature as a whole? Are we all allies and all dependent from each other? Is our inevitable interdependence a virtue or a vice, a strength or a weakness? I have the strongest persuasion that in times of global pandemic, that is, times of extreme vulnerability, Pelluchon's work is most useful for offering us new insights into good ways of living in interdependence and making the best of our finitude and our very, very vulnerable human condition. So, Corine, I have the pleasure to call upon you to talk to us on taking vulnerability and corporality seriously. What does it change for ethics and politics, and why it could make ecology and the animal cause enter democracy?
Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me? It's okay? Yeah. So I have tried to summarize my thought in 40 minutes, and for this introduction, I will say that the main theme of my research is corporality. Why does it change for ethics and politics? What does it change when we take corporality seriously? What light does it shed upon our human condition? To be sure, we as human beings are characterized by freedom, understood as the ability to make personal changes and to change it. But this conception of human being as a free moral agent is at the core of the human rights philosophy, and it still grounds our political and ethical theories. It enables us to grant every human being some rights, whatever could be his race, gender, and social status. In this regard, modernity achieves moral progress compared to the ancient social order, which was based upon privileges. Yet, this individualistic and even atomistic conception of the self and this focus on freedom amount to underestimating our dependence on nature and the biological, affective, social, and ecological conditions of our existence. This abstract conception of subjectivity leads to reduce ethics and politics to the relations we have with other human beings who are our contemporaries. According to the philosophy of human rights, the only limit to my right to use the resources and to do whatever we please for our own preservation is the other human beings. Future generations, animals understood as individual selves, and other species do not enter ethics nor politics. And the two main goals of the state remain security, that is to say, the peaceful coexistence between human beings, and the reduction of unfair inequalities between us. So our anthropological, ethical, and political tools cannot provide adequate guidance at the individual and collective level in the current ecological, technological, and demographical context. It does not enable us to define our obligations toward all the beings we harm in our daily life when we eat meat, when we consume dairy products, buy jeans which were made or fed by children in manufacturing workshops located in Asia, or when we use polluting energies whose their effects on ecosystems and health will be felt over thousands of years. The structure of all responsibility has changed since we cause damage to numerous beings we don't see or whom we did not intentionally want to harm. And it is the case with the atomic bomb and the nuclear energy. As Günther Anders said, in the age of the atomic bomb, but also in the age of contemporary technologies such as genetic engineering, our responsibilities goes far beyond our lifetime. We actually don't know exactly what we are doing, and the number of beings who will be harmed by the effects of our lifestyles and consuming habits is so high that it overcomes our ability to represent them and to be concerned by their fate. We don't feel pity for thousands and millions of people. And yet, it is not possible to be responsible for somebody if you don't care for him or don't feel concerned. The fact that the effects of our actions go beyond our intentions and that we don't see the face of our victims, who sometimes are not yet born, explains that we become more and more indifferent. We tend to behave like machines deprived of any moral sense. And this has also far-reaching consequences for democracy, because this political regime requires autonomous people who are prone to organize themselves to foster some changes at both the local level and the political or collective level. Moreover, the atomistic and intellectualistic conception of the self, which still underlies our politics, implies that the symmetry of power is a condition for citizenship, as in Hobbes. People suffering from cognitive impairments, or elderly people, or people who cannot give us back what we give to them, are in the best case the objects of our compassion, but there is no way of speaking of justice toward them. Either they are second-class citizens who never take part in the process of decision-making and who are condemned to political invisibility, such as elderly people, or people who have miserable conditions of life. We will probably care for them, cure them, but they will not have any influence on the content of the laws. And as for animals who have a certain agency because they know what to do and what fits them in order to flourish, but who cannot make laws in order to set limits to our right to use and abuse them, we consider that they are mere means for our ends. When they please us like pets, and as long as they please us, we cherish them, but animals raised for their fur or for their flesh are denied the right to flourish and even to live more than a couple of weeks. Lastly, we destroy forests and colonize all the lands as if wild animals did not count. Liminal animals like rodents who live in our towns, such as in Paris, there are a lot of rodents, they are simply eradicated. So we behave as if we had an absolute sovereignty above nature and the other living beings. Instead of considering we share the planet with them, they are denied all rights. On the contrary, once we insist upon our corporality, that is to say our vulnerability, but also our earthly condition, the fact that we need to eat, to breathe, that we occupy space, and so on, we understand that our lives are always intertwined with the lives of the others, be they human or non-human, present or future. We are relational selves. We need to be careful. Moreover, our lifestyles have always an impact upon the other human beings, upon animals, people living in other countries, and future generations. Our vulnerability, that is to say, our mortality, our exposure to viruses, to diseases, our dependence upon others and nature mean that human existence cannot be understood simply in light of the freedom of the will. So phenomena which escape our will and our mastery are all important. Our physicality, which is obvious in tiredness, aging, mortality, has to be taken into account. And the fact that the things we live in and the things we live from and depend upon, like food, water, air, do not answer our biological needs, but they please us and make us enjoy life or not. And this shows that pleasure is also an essential dimension of our existence. To exist does not mean to survive. Maybe there are some to exist does not mean to survive, but to flourish and to feel that life is love for itself. Therefore, to live from things is also to live with the others, since I have always an impact upon them. To habit means to habit the earth, to inhabit the earth means to cohabit with the others, be they human or non-humans, since we share the same earth. Not to mention my birth, which proves that I come from two other persons, or, as Paul Ricoeur said, that there is a trouble of many existences behind my own existence, since my birth refers to a line of ancestors and even an umbilical connection of the living. We actually are never alone, even when there is nobody at home with whom we can share our bread. Thus, ethics does not start the encounter of the other's face. And this is a difference between my own work and the philosophy of Levinas. Not only do animals enter ethics, but ethics makes sense once I eat. Ethics is a matter of self-limitation, and it is a decision to set limits to my right to use whatever pleases me for the sake of others. So to live is to live from, to live with, and to live for. Responsibility is as important as freedom, and it changes from within the meaning of freedom. And I will further develop this philosophy of corporality, which has two pillars, two chapters. And these chapters are, one, the ethics of vulnerability, and second, the phenomenology of nourishment. And I have developed these two chapters of my philosophy of corporality in ethics of vulnerability and nourishment, a philosophy of the political body. I will focus on the context of the ethics of vulnerability, which was the result of some meetings with healthcare professionals and so on. And I will say what is different, what distinguishes my approach from the standpoint of the ethics of care, which is close but also very different. And in the second part, I will develop the second dimension of my research, which is the political dimension. I will focus on the phenomenology of nourishment, which is a philosophy of our inhabiting the earth, and it implies our overcoming the dualism between nature and culture, life and existence. And I will focus on my approach of ecology and animal ethics, and this approach is different from the standpoint of animal. Is different from the approach we find in animal ethics, in the founding fathers of animal ethics, such as Peter Singer, Tom Regan. And I will show why the animal cause is also something that concerns humanism, concerns us. In the third part, I will face today's main challenge, which is the gap between theory and practice. And this gap between consciousness, action, theory and practice is very important, especially when we deal with climate change, but also with the animal issues, because everybody acknowledges that there is a problem, but very few people change their lifestyles, not to mention the fact that in our governments do not make the animal cause under politics, and it is the same with ecology. So I will try to I will try to show why an ethics of virtue could help us fill this gap. So, 3 parts. The first one, the phenomenology of corporality. To take corporality seriously does not only mean we insist upon our frailty and our mortality. It also emphasizes our passivity and the fact that we do not constitute everything. Then it paves the way to a certain manner of describing human being. Not only is the alteration of my body the proof that I cannot master everything, but the other human being also transcends my power to constitute him. He is always more than his appearance, and that failure to constitute the other makes me acknowledge that the meaning of my relationship with him is ethical, Levinas said. The other is not a mere object I could represent. His otherness, his uniqueness, which drives Levinas into speaking of the other space, challenges me, since the encounter with him proves that I'm not alone. The existence of the other puts me in question. Following Levinas, I stress the link between 2 experiences of passivity, which reveals the double dimension of vulnerability. First, passivity refers to the alteration of my body and the incompleteness of my psyche. This is the classical definition of vulnerability as frailty. Second, the encounter of the other is also an experience of passivity. It is a shock. Responsibility is different from my familial, professional, or social obligations. The obligations derive from my commitments. Responsibility is deeper. It's an experience which changes from within my subjectivity. The word I means here I am. There is a primacy of responsibility over freedom. Instead of considering my identity is determined by my will and individual preferences, I realized that my personal identity, my moral autonomy, is constituted by the way I answer the other's call. And for me, there is also a call coming from animals, understood as vulnerable selves. And there is a link between these 2 experiences of passivity, because vulnerability makes me be concerned by the other's face. Only a vulnerable being is able to be open, responsible for the other, open to the other. Vulnerability cannot be defined simply as frailty. It's also the ability to be concerned by the other, and in this regard, it's a strength. My openness to the other encompasses these 2 dimensions of vulnerability, of to be sure I'm psychologically, physically and socially fragile and cannot survive without the other's care, affection or recognition, but I'm also open to the other and the conception of human being as an atomistic self and of sociality as structured by the give and take rule is too simple. You could think that this ethics of vulnerability, which is the first chapter of a phenomenology of corporality, is close to the ethics of care. And it's, to be sure, the notion of vulnerability has a critical function, since it drives us into highlighting the relational dimension of subjectivity and our need of care. It also leads to reconfigure autonomy, which cannot be simply equated with the ideal of self-determination. Yet, there are a lot of differences between my approach and the ethics of care. The ethics of care is particularistic because it insists upon the particular bonds that tie with us, with others, and it focuses on situations of domination. It understands the relational dimension of subjectivity in a psychological way. In my approach, a phenomenological description of our corporality aims at determining some structures of existence which have a universalized dimension. So the method and the sources are all important and explain the differences between these two approaches, which are very close. And the goal of the ethics of vulnerability I developed was to provide a philosophy of the subject which could help us replace the philosophy of the subject that still grants political liberalism. But autonomy remains the goal of care, because also it is reconfigured and enriched by the taking into account of our passivity, of our carnal condition, and of our responsibility toward the other, be they human or non-human. So the ethics of vulnerability is the first chapter of this philosophy of corporality, which aims at refreshing the way we understand human condition and the meaning of our relationship with the others. This ethic was born at the hospital because when I came back from Boston University in 2007, where I have taught medical ethics and political philosophy, I decided to write a book on the ethical dilemmas and the political debates linked to medical practices and bioethics. And I visited a lot of units, some intensive care units, and encounter a lot of patients suffering from Alzheimer's disease and so on. And I was reading the works of Levinas and Ricoeur, whose books I had studied, and I understood that autonomy, which is a key notion in medical ethics, has to be reconfigured if we want that it makes sense in the clinical setting, when we meet patients suffering from cognitive impairments and who are not competent in the legal sense of the word, but of course we cannot deprive them from any autonomy. And this drove me into thinking autonomy as a double capacity, the ability to have desires and values, and this ability is not jeopardized by cognitive impairments, and the ability to express one's desire and set priorities. And this, of course, can be compromised by all the side effects of therapies and the cognitive impairments. So, but this reconfiguration of the autonomy principle sheds light upon also the moral traits healthcare professionals need to develop in order to decipher the will of a person who does not speak or whose memory is damaged. And all these ethical dilemmas we have when we deal with medical ethics and the encounter with patients in palliative care and so on, all the inquiry into the criteria to withhold life-sustaining treatments in comatose patients or patients whose higher brain is destroyed, led me to question the criteria to grant moral consideration to a being. The clinical setting and the physician-patient relationship were also the illustration of our responsibility toward the other, responsibility that goes deeper or further obligation. To be sure, the hospital was a kind of laboratory, since a lot of ethical categories such as justice, autonomy, responsibility, personal identity have to be reconfigured. And we understand that sometimes our classical definitions are too narrow. not to mention the political problems which are raised in medical ethics, in the decision-making, but also in bioethics when we tackle with the issues, the problems raised by biotechnologies, which oblige us to go beyond the opposition between the no-harm principle we find in Mill, and but we have to go beyond this no-harm principle when we have a problem, biotechnology which raise moral dilemmas that go beyond this, but we have to escape, to avoid political paternalism. But the most challenging issue, which I mentioned in the book Broken Autonomy, was the animal question. Because once you work on vulnerability and describes the passivity of the living, you cannot escape this question. And of course, it took me some time before I find my own way of speaking of the animal cause. And in the book, in the 2009 book, L'Autonomie brisée, I still followed the founding fathers of animal ethics who focus on anti-speciesism. But I developed my own approach in 2011 in Elements for the Ethics of Vulnerability. And instead of focusing on the moral, if not legal, status of animals in order to denounce the practices that inflict upon animals excruciating pain and psychological suffering, and I insisted upon us. So the focus was on the foundations of our politics and ethics that the animal question helps us to critically examine. As Derrida showed in The Animal That Therefore I Am, the animal question is strategic because it highlights the ontological boundaries that underlie traditional humanism and shows that it is based upon a subject defined as an autonomous rational individual, that is to say, upon an elitist standard that can explain the discrimination against all the beings that are not like us. However, my inquiry is not only critical. It actually aims at advocating a new way of thinking, which implies another humanism. The animal question drives us into making responsibility and vulnerability the major concepts of ethics and politics. There is somebody behind the fur, and there is a call coming from the animal seen as an individual, as a sentient being. And the animal is the object of my responsibility, but also it puts me into question. It asks me who I am. I am insofar as I answer the call of the other. I come after to a certain extent. I follow the other, who may be an animal. Moreover, the way we understand justice toward animals is at stake in the animal question, which is part of a broader approach, encompassing the reflection upon our inhabiting the earth and sharing resources with other beings. The question is, what would be an ethics and a politics that take animals seriously and aim at promoting a fairer coexistence with animals? This approach does not separate animals, humans, and ecology, and it draws a path that travels from ethics to politics in a constructive way. And these aspects are at the core of my approach, and the anthropological and ontological dimension and the political one are always connected. Second part, I will be quick. The phenomenology of nourishment is the second chapter of the phenomenology of corporality. Nourishment is a word to avoid the word resources. Nourishment is the word to speak of the natural but also cultural things I live in and depend upon. And it's a way of avoiding the word resource that reduces the world and nature to tools and means. And the word resource does not convey the idea of enjoyment, which is a part of existence. The phenomenological description of eating, dwelling, working, living in a place, and being co-residents with other human and non-human animals, breathes new life into the concept of human existence. Not only is the subject embodied and dependent on natural and cultural things that nourish his or her life, giving it taste or not, but the subject is also always rational. Eating is the paradigm of this philosophy that describes our being with the world and with the others. And the description of eating shows that we are always connected with current, past and future person and with other animals, not to mention the affective, social and cultural dimensions of eating. Such an embodied relational subject provides the foundations for another political theory in which the goals of the state can no longer be reduced to security and the reduction of unfair inequalities. The protection of the finite biosphere, the alleviation of animal suffering, the concern for future generations, and the consideration of all dimensions that enable me to flourish and not only to survive, frame a new social contract, which corresponds to the normative aspect of such a political theory. This global approach, which connects human beings, animals, and nature, and refers to a philosophy of existence, so ecology is articulated with existence. This global approach overcomes more modern and contemporary dualism between nature and culture. This dualism between nature and culture explains why political theory until now did not succeed in making ecology and animals enter democracy. For Western philosophies from Hobbes to Heidegger and even Rawls, nature is essentially a means to an end, and human beings are considered as free moral agents. And ecology is always secondary, or when people start to be worried about it. It is because the depletion of resources and the climate change threaten their lifestyles. With some premises, it's difficult to avoid coercion or to make ecology enter democracy, which is based upon consent and implies a deliberative term. But environmental ethics too failed and reinstalls a dualism between nature and culture, as seen with ecocentrism and its focus on wilderness. To be sure, environmental ethics in the 70s, as seen in Leopold and Calicot, Leopold before, rejects the idea of the human being as an empire, within an empire. One cannot deny its theoretical creativity, the introduction of the notion of non-instrumental, if not intrinsic value. However, it did not succeed in fostering people into changing their lifestyles, their consuming habits, and reduce their ecological footprint. Starting with animals or with nature, environmental and animal ethics denounced our abuses of animals and our degradation of nature, but did not provide adequate guidance to change the goals of the states. To avoid these two pitfalls, the dualism between nature and culture we find in the philosophy of freedom and the failure of environmental ethics, I myself consider ecology and animal welfare as chapters of a philosophy of existence that takes into account the materiality of our existence, the fact that we live in and depend upon natural and cultural things, such as food, trees, water, bridge landscapes, and towns. My approach does not reduce ecology to its environmental dimension, to the fight against climate change or the depletion of biodiversity. Understood as the wisdom of our inhabitation of the earth and its phenomenology. It includes social justice, a reflection into the condition of work, and a deep transformation of our model of productions. Moreover, the moral, if not spiritual dimension of ecology is all important. It refers to a way of considering our responsibility and our place in the universe, as well as a role played by nature and animals in our life. Before speaking of this dimension that leads to virtue ethics, let me speak briefly of the conditions that could make ecology and the animal cause enter democracy. The animal cause, as I said, is important in itself because animals suffer a lot because of our model of development, but it has also a strategic dimension. It shed light upon a model of development that dehumanizes us, the violence we inflict on animals, the way we exploit them without respecting their ecological norms and their subjectivity, which should set limits on our right to do whatever we please, are the mirror of what such model of development has made of us. It's so violent that many people use psychological devices such as denial or cognitive dissonance, or they repress their emotions in order to continue to function. And there becomes the erosion of this moral sense, make them more and more indifferent. To denounce animal abuse is a way of denouncing a system that is counterproductive. For the same token, the animal cause is a central chapter of a global project of reconstruction that aims at promoting another model of development based on the respect for the living, be they human or non-human, and whose social, sanitary, and environmental dimensions are all important. So ecological transition had 4 pillars, which cannot be separated. The protection of our biosphere and the respect for the planetary limits, and economy has to take into account these planetary limits. Second, health, animal and human health. 3, social justice, conditions of work, and 4, justice toward animals. However, how is it possible to alleviate the animal suffering and even to drive people into thinking that animals have the right to exist in a pluralistic society in which people do not share the same conceptions of the good? We have to institute the common good by listening to all the stakeholders and to achieve agreements about our disagreements. That is to say that we cannot refuse conflictuality, but we have also to find a common, to institute the common good and to find agreements. And this is very difficult because animals do not vote and they have not the capacity to prosecute us. They need human beings to make their interests be represented and taken into account in the public space. So there is an asymmetry between human beings and animals that explain that those who are committed to the animal cause have to convince their fellow citizens that the alleviation of the animal suffering does not lead to misery. So the strategy, the key, the 3 notions which are at the core of the strategy are transition, innovation, and reconversion. That is to say that we cannot impose upon the others vegetarianism and so on, but we have to say what we can change and how in the context of a pluralistic society. But I think that the point is to understand that the prejudices that explain why people accept to the animal suffering has something to do with dominion, and the acceptance of vulnerability, of otherness is also a key to eradicate the dominion, which is a 3-fold dominion upon nature, upon the others, but also upon us, upon nature in us, as Adorno and Horkheimer said. And for the moral progress which could help us foster another model of development that corresponds to what I call the age of the living, implies we do not need to exert our power over the others. And this supposes an enlargement of the self I will further develop in the last part of this presentation. Because I have no time to speak of the strategy to further develop the strategy to make the animal cause enter politics, but we could discuss before after. Virtue ethics. Well, what is the problem? Why could be virtue ethics necessary? Because there is a gap, as I said, between theory and practice. It seems to be difficult to change our lifestyles and achieve environmental sustainability Although no one can deny that our model of development has a destructive ecological and social impact, and that it inflicts violence on animals. So, in an attempt to respond to these challenges and reduce the gap between theory and practice, I have proposed a virtue ethics that was expounded in Éthique de la Considération. Instead of focusing on principles or on the consequences of our action, a virtue ethics is interested in our concrete motivations, that is to say, in the representations and the effects that encourage us to act. It insists on the moral traits that could lead us to be temperate and have pleasure in doing the good instead of being constantly torn between happiness and duty. Moreover, respect for nature or respect for animals do not derive from duties or norms. The ethics of care and economy and ecofeminism have shown that our capacity to care for others is linked to the particular bonds that tie us with them. Emotions and affects cannot be ignored when we try to understand what made people lead to change their lifestyles. Moreover, we have to pay attention to our negative emotions instead of repressing them. But I think that as the eco-feminists point out, our fear for the planet and for the health of our children can be a starting point to denounce the inability of states that focus only on production and growth and are blind to the impact of production on health. And being aware of what endangers nature is also an opportunity to turn one's situation of vulnerability into a strength, since it provides the emotional maturity required to restore one's capacity to act and to cooperate with the others instead of exerting our power over them. These moral traits can help us and help individuals, especially those who were assigned to subordinate roles, of course. But also, I agree with this entirely. It's obvious that without a process of self-transformation and individuation, I think we cannot succeed in changing our way of inhabiting the earth and making room for others, including the other species. I think that particular relationships and emotions are not enough to give birth to virtues or moral traits that change our way of being and our behavior. The difference between the ethics of care and virtue ethics is also that the key to virtue ethics is the following. The key to environmental virtues and the alleviation of animal suffering for the ethics of care is my relation with myself. And it's also an experience of the incommensurable. And this point stresses the difference between the ethics of consideration and ecofeminism, although they have much in common. The ethics of consideration takes its sources from the morals of antiquity, but it rejects their essentialism. It is based upon a philosophy of the subject that takes the materiality of our existence and our corporality seriously. The ethics of consideration also borrows from the modern, especially from Spinoza, the idea that only a process of individuation that enlarges the self can change our relationship with others and create new effects, such as joy and gratitude. As in Enneth, who always refers to Spinoza when he speaks of ecology, the enlargement of the self, which implies knowledge of the interactions with other life, but has also an impact upon my affects, explain why I have pleasure by consuming less. It's not only psychological, but the moral trait as a result of both representation and affects. We are also able to integrate in our own good, the common good that entails nature. The importance of freedom and the process of individuation that implies that my relation with myself depends on my relation to the incommensurable is the specificity of my ethic of virtue, because it does differentiate it from Aristotle. For Aristotle, prudence is all important, but I think that prudence does not suffice. And I borrow from Bernard de Clairvaux, the word consideration, which encompasses prudence, but it's not a virtue. It's rather the global attitude upon which all the virtues are grounded and which prevents them from turning into vice. And it has two conditions. The first one is humility. Yes, I'll finish. Which is not a virtue either, but a way of preparing from consideration by fighting pride and reminding us that we are engendered beings. And the second is this relation, this experience of the incommensurable. But for Bernard de Clairvaux, it is faith. Only faith can help us be virtuous and avoid dominion. For me, I do not speak of transcendence, but of transcendence, which was a word which was coined by Lévinas, by Jean Val, a friend of Lévinas. And it's a way of speaking of something that overcomes me, but I make the experience of this, of what overcomes me. It's the experience of the common world, which entails the past, present, and future generations, institutions, and to be born means that we belong to this world that is older than us and welcomes us when we come to life. And when we are mindful of our engendered condition and when we experience of vulnerability, we better feel the bonds that tie us with other vulnerable beings. So it outlines a movement of deepening of oneself and of one's carnal condition that permits us to experience the link that unites us to other living beings, and it transforms the consciousness of one's belonging to the common world into a lived knowledge that changes from within our way of interacting with the other. So I have to finish, but it is true that this experience is connected with something carnal. It's not only an intellectual assessment or awareness of our belonging to a common world, and it's based upon it is no longer based upon dualism between mind, body, reason, and emotion. So to understand, to make just concluding remarks, far from being the rejection of humanism, the promotion of a more sustainable model of development, which corresponds to what I call the age of the living, is the promotion of a new humanism linked to the respect for the vulnerability we have in common with animals, and it is linked to the acknowledgement of the otherness of the other. So the point is to eradicate dominion, which is dominion upon nature of animals, but also upon oneself. And this domination turns rationality into irrationality and led to totalitarianism, but also it made technology become completely autonomous. This is why it is not only necessary today to defend the enlightenment against the counter-enlightenment and the awakening of nationalism, the rejection of rationality and human rights. In a context marked by environmental and health crisis, we cannot be content to invoke. We have to renew the story of enlightenment and to resist the amputation of reason, now reduced to an instrument for calculation. And this is why the objective and the enlightenment at the age of the living, and it's the title of my forthcoming book, is to eliminate the dominion schema, the dominion of others and of nature, and it has something to do with the enlargement of the self, but also it provides it renews rationalism and enables us to fulfill the promises of the ancient enlightenment. But of course, it's paradoxical because for that we have to overcome the anthropocentrist and dualist foundations of the old enchantment and of the old rationalism, which was hegemonistic and which could not protect us from destructiveness. So sorry for being too long, but it's very difficult to summarize one's thoughts in 40 minutes.
Actually, Corine, is such a rich questioning, rich in concepts, rich in critical issues that you've raised. I would say that it's paradigmatic in the sense that there is the old paradigm within modernity, which is the paradigm of dominion of the modern sovereign subject, and then there is the rise, the slow rise of a new paradigm. It's slow and it's painful because it's not something everybody wants or wishes, okay? Yes. For different reasons and different interests, all kinds of interests, which do not wish this new paradigm to rise. So this new paradigm, which is more integral, let's say, in a sense, holistic in another sense.
I'm not sure holistic. I'm not sure. Because to make room for other beings requires that we know ourselves. And it's not a mystical union with the whole, with the all. I think this could be it could be not a dead end, but excuse me, I have interrupted you.
Yeah, it's just a question. It's just something I'm wondering myself, actually. I would like us to move to George Farakla's response, and then I open the floor to discussion right after George's response, which will also raise questions, George. And please, Adonis, could you have the Greek translation for the audience? Because George is gonna speak in French, okay? So, Adonis, can we have the text, the Greek translation for George's response?
I think she does not hear you.
Yeah, that's what I think. Okay, Adonis, are you? Okay, okay, you're somewhere in cyberspace. Okay. Okay, here you are. So we can have the text on. So, no, Adonis, we cannot. It was just a quick translation I had earlier this afternoon, but I hope, okay, perfect, thank you. Thank you, Adonis.
Okay. Shall I proceed?
Okay. So we see the translation. So, Giorgo, you can start with your own text, okay, and we will follow from the Greek translation.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I think I realize it's some kind of weird that Corine Pelluchon, who is French, speaks to us in English, and I, who am Greek, will speak in French. But on the other hand, I mean, it's a way that to have hospitality, which is not so bad, maybe. Okay. Donc, je vais parler en français sur l'éthique de la considération de Corine Pelluchon. Et je ne vais pas parler plus de 10 minutes, ne vous inquiétez pas. Dans l'éthique de la considération, Corine Pelluchon propose une morale apte à promouvoir un modèle de développement écologiquement soutenable et plus juste. J'essaie de ne pas parler trop vite pour que d'éventuels auditeurs qui comprendraient le français puissent me suivre. Okay? Une éthique qui sous-tendrait une politique qui serait à même de réussir à temps la transition environnementale. Cette réflexion, menée au long de la cartographie proposée par l'éthique de la considération, s'appuie sur d'autres travaux où Corine Pelluchon s'est appliquée à fonder une nouvelle philosophie politique, tenant enfin compte de notre corporéité, de notre vulnérabilité, bref, j'entends un drôle de bruit, je ne sais pas si c'est votre cas également.
Oui, il y a un drôle de bruit.
Παιδιά το blender κλείστε. Oui. Ok, ben j'y vais. Une nouvelle philosophie politique tenant enfin compte de notre corporalité, de notre vulnérabilité, bref, de notre insertion dans le monde, insertion qui aurait dû nous amener à construire toutes nos philosophies autrement, sans attendre que notre surexploitation de la Terre nous oblige à cesser de vivre enfermés dans notre délire de toute puissance et nous rappelle de la manière forte notre absolue dépendance envers ce cadre, l'environnement, qui n'est au vrai ni un cadre ni un environnement, mais la matière dont nous sommes faits, la nourriture dont nous tirons notre être. Corine Pelluchon n'est pas une amie du capitalisme, ou plutôt elle est opposée au primat de l'économie, à ce qu'elle appelle l'économisme, et qu'elle définit de façon tout à fait classique comme cette conception erronée de l'économie qui consiste à prendre les moyens pour des fins. Je dis qu'elle le fait de façon tout à fait classique, car tel est déjà le reproche adressé par Aristote à la crématistique, forme dévoyée de l'économie, et ce même reproche sera repris par Karl Marx contre le capitalisme. En effet, de tels moyens érigés en fin ne servent guère qu'à enrichir des groupes privés au moyen de l'exploitation des hommes, mais aussi de la nature et des animaux. L'économisme n'est pas limité au capitalisme. Le capitalisme n'en est que la version aujourd'hui triomphante. L'économisme est en fait la base tant des libéraux que des socialistes qui se sont opposés sur les tréteaux de la scène politique depuis tantôt 2 siècles. Il est leur présupposé commun dont il s'agit à présent de sortir sous peine de mort. Hannah Arendt s'est trompée sur le travail. Elle a tort, selon Corine Pelluchon, de le réduire à la seule survie, suivant en cela son maître en philosophie politique qui n'est autre qu'Aristote. Mais elle ne s'est pas trompée, du moins aux yeux de Corine Pelluchon, sur l'importance du monde commun qui, selon elle, doit prendre la place occupée par Dieu dans la pensée de Bernard de Clairvaux, à savoir celle de l'incommensurable, dont l'expérience permettra à chacun d'entre nous de mesurer les choses que nous connaissons, non moins que de mesurer nos ardeurs en ce qui concerne les choses que nous faisons. L'expérience du monde commun est l'expérience de l'incommensurable, dans la mesure où il s'agit tout simplement de l'expérience de notre communauté de destin avec les autres vivants. On le voit, l'inter-esse de Hannah Arendt est ici élargi aux êtres vivants et aux choses inertes, en même temps que son amour du monde n'est plus limité à l'univers humain, mais rattaché à la volonté de faire vivre les vivants, ou plutôt de ne pas les en empêcher. Parallèlement, si Corine Pelluchon reprend à Arendt l'idée que la natalité est une catégorie centrale de la philosophie politique, ce n'est ni pour la restreindre au monde humain, ni bien entendu pour verser dans le biologisme, lequel paraît menacer toute pensée qui s'écarte du domaine du social. De même que Corine Pelluchon s'attache à penser en dehors du cadre commun des libéraux et des socialistes, qu'elle appelle économisme, de même, elle se place résolument sur un plan transversal à une opposition reçue du culturel et du naturel qu'elle désigne comme dualisme. C'est ce que paraît signifier le fait que, après avoir emprunté à Arendt le concept de natalité pour édifier une politique convenant à l'éthique de la considération, elle se tourne vers Robert Maggiori, élève de Vladimir Jankélévitch, pour lui emprunter le concept de convivence, cette autre catégorie phare de la politique de la considération selon ses propres termes. Les propres termes de Corine Pelluchon. À vrai dire, la convivence, concept proposé par Maggiori en 1985, semble cristalliser en elle un troisième changement de cadre, sorti de l'économisme et du dualisme, c'est-à-dire placé dans la position d'un anticapitalisme qui est aussi un antisocialisme, et dans celle d'un refus de l'insularité humaine, qui va de pair avec le refus de réduire symétriquement l'homme à ce que l'on décrète être sa nature. Nous voilà sur le point de sortir d'une troisième fausse alternative. Dans la troisième partie de son ouvrage de la convivence, Robert Maggiori veut aller de la liberté à l'amour. Le dernier chapitre est intitulé « Modestie, humilité, amour ». L'humilité y est définie comme l'acmé de la modestie, non comme une lâcheté, ni comme la volupté de se montrer humble quand on n'est qu'impuissant, ni enfin comme une humilité chrétienne, telle qu'elle est entendue habituellement, qui attend une contrepartie. Elle est une mise en disponibilité du moi, qui n'est pas étrangère à une économie masochiste, L'humilité consisterait ainsi à se rendre réceptif non seulement à autrui, mais au monde, sans rien en attendre. Cette description, tirée elle-même du traité des vertus de Jean Kelevitch, se retrouve sous la plume de Corine Pelluchon, me semble-t-il, et dans la même perspective que celle de Maggiore. L'amour d'autrui et l'amour du monde surmontent l'opposition traditionnelle et désormais insoutenable de l'égoïsme et de l'altruisme. Tel me semble être du moins le sens de la convivence chez Maggiore et Pelluchon, et j'aimerais avoir son sentiment à ce sujet. En effet, la définition de l'amour qui permet à Maggiore de renvoyer dos à dos le libéralisme de marché et le socialisme d'État, qui sont en un sens l'égoïsme et l'altruisme institués, c'est de choisir l'autre plutôt que soi-même, je cite, de se comporter en masochiste, bref, de renoncer à ses droits et de les recevoir en retour par l'autodépossession du moi d'autrui. Permettez-moi d'expliciter un peu mon propos. Il y a dans la tradition, à mon avis, deux manières de lier l'égoïsme à l'altruisme. L'une fut en vogue au XVIIe et surtout au XVIIIe siècle. L'autre semble faire timidement son apparition concurremment à la première au XVIIIe et plus nettement à partir du XIXe siècle. Selon la première, l'égoïsme de chacun aboutit globalement à l'avantage de tous. On peut déceler ce schème dès le contrat social de Hobbes, chez qui le calcul égoïste de chacun débouche par lui-même sur la soumission commune au souverain, bénéfique pour tous. La forme classique de ce schème apparaîtra toutefois sous les espèces de la main invisible d'Adam Smith et de l'insociable sociabilité d'Emmanuel Kant. L'égoïsme se mue en altruisme, malgré lui, mécaniquement, du simple fait que l'égoïsme de l'un se trouve confronté à celui de l'autre. L'autre manière de résoudre ce conflit est médiatisée par la conscience. Rousseau pensait que le maître de l'esclave n'est pas plus libre que son esclave. Que le maître de l'esclave n'est pas plus libre que son esclave. Cette idée est développée systématiquement par Hegel dans la lutte pour la reconnaissance. C'est une idée, notons-le, qui est propre aux modernes. Arendt remarque à juste titre qu'elle est étrangère aux anciens, pour qui la liberté du maître et de l'esclave est bien en rapport inverse et non direct. Cette idée moderne aboutira à la belle formulation de Bakounine, selon laquelle il est dans mon intérêt égoïste que tous les autres soient libres. Si ta servitude retentit sur moi et érode ma liberté, il ne faut plus dire que ma liberté s'arrête là où commence la tienne, mais que la tienne et la mienne naissent et grandissent ensemble. Dans ce cas de figure, l'égoïsme s'associe de telle façon à l'altruisme que leur opposition même paraît vide de sens. Si l'altruisme est un impératif égoïste, il ne peut plus être le contraire de l'égoïsme. Si la convivence est le nom d'une coexistence des vivants, humains ou non, au terme de laquelle la liberté de l'un est en rapport direct et non inverse à la liberté de l'autre, alors cette liberté n'est plus définie dans le cadre de l'affirmation de soi du moi, mais dans le cadre d'un moi qui ne se croit libre que dans la mesure où il s'humilie devant l'autre, où il se laisse pénétrer par lui, pour utiliser une expression forte reprise par Corine Pelluchon à Simone Veil. Cette thématique qui de l'humilité conduit à l'amour se décline tant du point de vue moral que du point de vue gnoséologique. Hegel disait bien que le concept aime ce qu'il connaît. Il me semble qu'elle prolonge et fonde la seconde des deux façons, la manière consciente d'associer l'égoïsme à l'altruisme. En effet, elle tente à faire apparaître que l'opposition des deux termes reposerait sur une sorte de malentendu épistémologique, consistant à croire que l'égoïsme de ma liberté suppose la servitude d'autrui et non sa liberté au même titre que la mienne. Si cette conjecture était vérifiée, si Corine Pelluchon a bien à l'esprit cette façon moderne de surmonter le dilemme entre égoïsme et altruisme, alors une question qui se pose à mes yeux est la suivante. Peut-on fonder une politique sur une telle base? Si le sadisme des sujets hobbesiens s'avère déboucher sur le masochisme des sujets humbles et aimants, peut-on enfin espérer que le rêve d'une société sans domination pourrait se voir réalisé, contrairement à ce que nous pouvions supposer au vu de cet égoïsme dont chacun sait qu'il est inhérent à la nature humaine? La crainte de la mort collective sera-t-elle suffisante pour nous amener à la raison? Au vrai, pourquoi les humains signeraient-ils un contrat entre eux en faveur des autres êtres vivants, au lieu de se borner à en signer un à propos de leurs propriétés respectives, de leur droit à dominer et exploiter le monde, comme l'économisme les invite à le faire, si ce n'est par peur de mourir, comme le faisait remarquer Michel Serres en commentant un tableau de Goya où deux duellistes s'enfoncent dans les sables mouvants. Corine Pelluchon soutient dans son manifeste animaliste que la transition vers une société juste envers les animaux passe nécessairement par une sortie du capitalisme, système fondé sur l'exploitation. Mais pourquoi les égoïstes qui profitent de ce système devraient-ils se résoudre à en sortir? Serait-ce parce que les laissés pour compte sont plus nombreux? Serait-ce parce que la catastrophe ne les épargnera pas non plus? Bref, serait-ce par peur? Ou bien serait-ce aussi parce que c'est dans leur intérêt? Je penche pour la seconde alternative. Corine Pelluchon est une philosophe politique. Elle se soucie de convaincre, contrairement à Peter Singer. Elle ne dédaigne pas de s'adresser aux émotions de ses lecteurs. C'est en ce sens qu'elle devait, me semble-t-il, souligner que le rapport à soi de notre espèce implique intrinsèquement celui aux autres, et de la même manière que c'est dans notre rapport individuel à nous-mêmes qu'est nécessairement impliqué le rapport à l'autre. Homme, vivant, monde. Ce n'est donc pas seulement par peur qu'elle nous incite à agir, mais bien pour être pleinement nous-mêmes. Il est dans notre intérêt égoïste, oserais-je dire, d'être altruiste, car nous ne sommes vraiment libres que quand tous et toutes est libre. Voilà.
Georges, merci. C'était tellement dense, n'est-ce pas, Corine? Tellement dense.
Je peux réagir?
Oui.
Bien sûr, bien sûr.
Alors, merci de cette interprétation parce que c'est assez libre. Alors, moi, je cite mes sources. Hein. J'ai beaucoup souffert ces dernières années en France de plagiat. Donc, moi, dès que je prends un mot qui ne vient pas de moi, je le cite. Mais ma approche est très différente de celle de Maggiori, qui est un élève de Yankelevitch et qui se situe sur le plan de la morale avec ce couple égoïsme altruiste que vous avez parfaitement expliqué. Moi, j'ai pris le mot convivence parce que c'est lui qui l'a amené en français, bien qu'il vienne de l'espagnol. Hein. Mais moi, je lui donne une catégorie politique. C'est pas la convivialité. Bon, d'abord, ça vient de cum, c'est vrai vivere, changer des vivres. Et donc, ça va avec la matérialité de l'existence, sur laquelle j'insiste. Mais moi, j'en fais la considération à son plus bas degré. C'est déjà la considération. L'idée d'appartenir à un monde commun, mais qui s'arrête aux humains, quoi. C'est déjà pas mal. Hein. Parce qu'évidemment, pour moi, le sommet de la considération, c'est la conscience d'une appartenance à un monde commun qui va jusqu'à promouvoir une vie meilleure pour les animaux. Mais là, pour la transmission d'un monde habitable, au-delà de moi-même. Mais déjà, la convivence, c'est une modalité, il y a des degrés de la considération. Et voilà, donc ça, c'est vraiment important. Et je ne me situe pas du tout dans une réflexion psychologique ou morale, mais dans une éthique des vertus où la clé, ce n'est pas le rapport aux autres qui est la clé du rapport à moi, c'est le rapport à moi-même qui est la clé du rapport aux autres. Et là-dessus, je suis vraiment la disciple de l'éthique des vertus venant d'Aristote. Les choix des biens a un impact sur le régime de mon affectivité, sur mon comportement. Donc là, je suis vraiment, c'est vraiment très différent du type de pensée qu'on a chez Yankelevitch ou qu'on aura, voilà. Donc ça, c'est vraiment important. Hein. C'est encore une philosophie de la liberté, mais c'est une philosophie de la liberté qui est complètement changée parce que le sujet, je suis beaucoup plus spinoziste, moi. Le sujet s'est élargi. Le sujet, prenant conscience de ses interactions avec les autres, prenant conscience de son appartenance au monde commun et prenant cette conscience, la vivant, n'était pas seulement intellectuelle mais incarnée, alors il se produit un changement dans le régime de ses affectivités, dans ses manières d'être. Je dois beaucoup plus à Spinoza et à Annès qu'à Yankelevitch. Donc là, mais votre interprétation est très stimulante, mais c'est vraiment autre chose. Et du coup, et là je rebondis, évidemment que moi je pense que sur une réflexion morale, on ne peut pas fonder une politique. Moi je pense que la politique, d'abord, c'est deux choses. C'est des institutions, des normes, il en faut, des réglementations. Et j'épouse l'artificialisme du contrat social pour la même raison que Hobbes. L'humain ne peut pas être sûr de vouloir demain ce qu'il voulait hier. Il faut de l'artifice. C'est pas un fait, c'est une norme. En raison de sa destructivité, il faut de l'artifice. Mais c'est pas seulement ça. Il faut aussi vouloir vivre ensemble. Ça, c'est la grande leçon d'Hannah Arendt. C'est aussi la grande leçon de mon maître qui est le Strauss. Mais voilà. Donc du coup, il faut. Et du coup, comment faire en sorte que ne soit pas détruit à l'avance le désir de vivre ensemble. Comment, bon, c'est la grande question de Platon, hein, Lévi-Strauss, c'est quand même tout ça. Hein. C'est cette, donc, comment équiper les êtres, les individus, pour qu'ils soient des citoyens et qu'eux-mêmes, ils intègrent au cœur de leur intérêt propre l'intérêt élargi aux générations futures et aux animaux, et qui prennent la mesure d'une responsabilité qui, en raison de nos modes de vie et de nos technologies, va beaucoup plus loin que notre vie présente, comme le dit Günther Anders. Donc du coup, quelle transformation de soi peut les amener à ça, et étant entendu, de même sur l'humilité, je ne sais pas, moi je suis vraiment plus Bernard de Clairvaux que Jankélévitch, mais en même temps, je trouve que c'est très intéressant ces éclairages qui montrent d'autres manières de voir des choses et qui pointent vraiment la difficulté. Et je ne suis pas sûre d'avoir été toujours compris d'ailleurs en France là-dessus, sur l'articulation entre l'éthique et la politique. L'éthique des vertus, c'est une éthique comme transformation de soi, mais elle a des implications fondamentales en politique. Mais ce livre-là, la considération, il venait après les nourritures, dont la deuxième partie est un projet politique. C'est vraiment du complément. C'est vrai que je ne mets pas tout sur les dos, les épaules de l'individu, parce qu'il faut des changements structurels, il faut des changements économiques, il faut de la conflictualité, il faut être capable de l'organiser.
Corine, excuse me for interrupting, it's just that I'll have to translate.
I know.
Okay, it's so rich. I don't know how I'm gonna do that. So actually, Corine responded to something George Faraklus talked about in his talk, the notion of convivence. Huh?
I should have spoken in English. I should have answered in English.
Okay, I'll summarize and perhaps you can add to. So it's the concept of convivence, which George connected to Jankélévitch and to a pupil of French philosopher Vladimir Jankélévitch, Robert Maggiore. Corine was against this sort of connection between Maggiore and her own idea of vulnerability and convivence as a first stage in her ethics of éthique de la considération, ηθική της υπόλοιψης, because her focus is political. It's not moral in the sense we have it in Jankélévitch. Everything has to start in a certain sense from the self, okay? And she mentioned that she's more in the line of Spinoza, in the line of an enlarged notion of the self, that in a strictly, let's say, moral sense in that of Jankélévitch. Corine, I don't know if I understood you well. Would you like to elaborate on this?
Yes, just two things. Convivence is a word which did exist in Spanish, but it appears in French because of Maggiore. But he has a psychological and moral conception of this notion, and I myself highlighted the political conception dimension of this notion, which is a stage of consideration. It's a simple stage. It's not the higher degree of consideration, because it's in part the fact that I consider that I'm not alone and that I belong to a community of fellow citizens, which is not enough for me, but it's good because it helps me be concerned by the fate of my fellow citizen and to be able to cooperate and to change my lifestyles and my ways of producing and so on. But of course, for me, consideration implies an enlargement of the self, who is aware of his belonging to a common world, which is deeper and older than, which is older and larger than his nation and his social and political community. But of course, it takes some time to enlarge yourself. And of course, my great inspirator, and it is at the core of the definition of the ethics of care, it is at the core of the definition of virtue ethics. The key of my relation to nature and to the others is my relation to myself. And we find this in Aristotle and Plato, which who think that the choice of the goods have an impact upon my desires and my interaction with other people. And as you remember, the book 8 of the Republic of Plato, the choice of some good, of money, for instance, have far-reaching consequences in the political regime, because it drives people into being unable to live together. And it was the beginning of the oligarchy and democracy and tyranny. But for me, this intellectual standpoint does not suffice, and I think that the choice of the good, the values, as we say nowadays, are not sufficient. And it's also not only the knowledge of my interaction with the other forms of living change from within, my way of considering my place in the universe and my relationship to the others, including animals, but also the fact that I deeply understand that I was born in a world which was older than me, that I face my own mortality and corporality. This can change also my way of understanding the meaning of my existence, and this enlarge myself and can lead me to have the desire to promote a more sustainable world. And so, but this is an enlargement of the self, which is you can be also, you can think of book 5 of Spinoza's Ethic, or of what the great Norwegian philosopher Ernest does with when he speaks of ecology. But again, and lastly, I do not say that everything depends on the individuals, because we need structural changes, economic changes, we need institutions, but without moral traits, without the ability of people to cooperate and to organize themselves, and without their ability to deliberate and to institute the common good, even when they deal with very difficult issues, nothing is possible except a tyranny or coercion. So if we want a democratic answer to all the challenges we are confronted with, we need very strong people, but people will have a kind of psychological maturity, and it's more than psychological maturity. We need people who are able to integrate in their own personal interests the interest of the other beings. And when ecologists speak of sobriety, they tend to focus on sacrifice. When they speak of ecological transition, they think that it's a burden, but the virtue ethics, the virtue-based ethics help us to understand how is it possible to have pleasure in consuming less. How somebody understand that the well-being of animals is part of his or her own well-being, and it's not egoism, it's another way of seeing, of interacting, and it's a loss of the dominion we exert over the others. And thus it is true that the fact that reason today turn into irrationality, that reason and even sciences have been cut from what Husserl called Lebenswelt. The fact that the triumph of instrumental rationality is also the triumph of a man who is cut from himself. And I think that for me, we have to deeply to further and to deeply understand how is it possible to reconcile ourselves, with a part of ourselves, and to overcome this threefold dominion, which explains all the catastrophes we had during the 20th century, and which will lead to the extension, and which explain why technologies are becoming autonomous and so on. But of course, I do not say that everything is the individual level is everything. But I think that we have to we have to speak of politics, but political theories are not only a matter of institutions. They need people who are this or that. And today, how is it possible to speak of ecological transition without advocating coercion or another tyranny? Well, we have to change from within people, and it's also something which has to do with the fact that the freedom of my fellow citizen is not the only limit to my to me. The existence of the future generation, the existence of other speakers set limits to my right to do whatever I please for my own preservation. And this has nothing to do with psychology or with what Marjorie or Jan Lankiewicz said. It's another method. But it's very interesting to hear another thing, another way of understanding these issues.
So, Corine, your philosophy is much more than a speculative philosophy. It's a critical diagnosis of current times, which makes it extremely interesting for all of us, either philosophers or not. And before we move to our young researchers, I would like to open the discussion to the floor and see if we have questions, either for Corine, especially for Corine, also for George, having Corine as a starting point. Do we have questions?
I saw somebody.
I have a question.
I saw somebody.
Is it you? Okay.
I have a question, but I don't know.
Okay, Evangelia.
All right, okay. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for this great and intellectually stimulating talk. Thank you also, George, for his contribution. Actually, I'm a psychologist, so this means that I'm quite far away from your ideas. However, I'd like to ask whether you can see narcissism and omnipotence, all right, as the other side of the same coin, if you want, because vulnerability and strength, the two different concepts belong at the same time in the psychological being of the human being. So I'm wondering whether how you see defenses in this way of thinking, and whether you see affect and inner reality somewhere.
Excuse me, I have not understood. How?
Inner reality, internal world. Whether you can see this as a part of the vulnerability, and whether you can also see the relational dimension as a weakness or as a strength, okay, relating with the other.
I don't understand. Can you help me go forward?
Okay, yes. Okay, so the question is whether defense mechanisms.
Defenses.
Defense mechanisms.
Okay.
Can be seen as a part of your way.
Weakness or strength? This is your question?
Yes, and also where you can see whether you can see the idea of omnipotence somewhere in this thing. Παντοδυναμία, στα γαλλικά δεν ξέρω. Okay.
Toute puissance.
Oui, I have understood. Because I don't know why, but there is echoes when you speak, and I don't understand very well what you say. It is cut.
All right, yeah, that's it.
Maybe the microphones, I don't know. So the first question was the psychological device that we use to be able to cope with negative emotions, are the strength or frailty. So I think psychological device, but you know better than me, this are at the beginning some way of being able to function. We need sometimes to have a part of denial. If you look at every day, if you look at the suffering of animals, for instance, you cannot breathe. But at the same time, these strategical devices turn to be to lead us to be indifferent and to and on the contrary, the fact that people are able to share their fear, to share their negative emotions, help them to recover and to be able to feel that they are able to do this or that. And it was the story of these people who found the ecofeminism, because ecofeminism at the beginning was not intellectual people. It was mothers who were afraid of the health problems of their children, who lived who lived in an environment which was destroyed, and then they had health problems, and these women became aware of, they were afraid, and nobody answered, and they focus, they have pointed out that the state was not able to answer their needs. So they organize themselves, they share their emotional problems, their negative emotion, and they went through, and they were able to recover. And as in Aristotle, we see that courage does not mean that we repress or fear, but we see the fear, and then we go through, and then we are able to see what we can do here and now. So negative emotions are strength, but we need to learn to go through them and to be able to act instead of to avoid them or to have a sense of panic. So, as I said, the two head ends. And courage, virtues have something to do with pleasure, pain, and emotions. And this is very important in Aristotle. He says that it's not only a matter of reflection. And when we deal with problems which I try to tackle, animal issues, environmental issues, health issues, we have uncertainty, things that are unpredictable, fear, negative things, death, the fact that we lack power. So, but we have to go through this and to share them. So this is the first point. And the second, omnipotence, of course. I think that there is two ways of understanding the genealogy of nihilism, which explains the barbarism. The first one, and Adorno and Horkheimer in Dialectic of Reason made it very well. They explain what was going on with the late modernity, the fact that reason was cut from any universalized dimension and became a tool for exploitation, for calculation, and instrumental reason explained bureaucracy and a lot of things. But I think that we have to deeper analyze the vice of our civilization. And I think that the fact that we cut civilization from nature and that we separated human from the other living beings open a vicious circle, open a dialectic, a destructive dialectic that explains why we scorn the other living beings, why we have scorned the other cultures, why we were not able to resist barbarism and so on. So I think that today we cannot change our model of development and achieve the ecological transition if we do not deconstruct a lot of dualism and representations that explain some the inability of people to live together, the inability of people to achieve equality between women and men, the inability of people to make room for the others, and including animals. So, of course, the ecological transition requires some very direct changes in the way we produce meat, in the way we cultivate lands, and so on, and share resources. We need to change the way we work, because agriculture and husbandry are today equated with an industry, and this makes no sense. But we have, and the contribution of philosophy is also to shed light on the depth of ecology. If we understand ecology as the wisdom of our inhabitation of the world, as a way of being with the other, and when I eat, when I'm dwelling, when I use resources, I am with the others. I say whether I set limits to my right to do whatever I please for the sake of future generations of animals and of the others. So that is to say that ethics and justice make sense once I live, once I exist, because I don't live only from air, but I live from air, but I live from food, I live from lands, and I have to share, and especially when there are so many people. So, and I think this is and omnipotence is part of dominion, is a way of, it's a desire, is a need of, is the fact that we do not assess our limits. And I think that the assessment, the acknowledgement of the limits of the planet is not possible without the knowledge of our limits. This is why humility is so important. It's not only a word like that, which is nice. So it's very, very important. And of course, we are the girls and the boys of Freud, and we know that there is destructiveness in humankind. And of course, culture is a way of helping people not to master some things, but to change some pulsions, some negative pulsions into other things. And of course, the responsibility of culture is all important. And I do not scorn Western civilization, on the contrary, but I think that we have to work a lot in order to excavate and to extirpate the vice of our civilization, and in order to advocate and to preserve what is great in our civilization, the pillars of enlightenment, that is to say, the autonomy of the subject, the desire, the promotion of a society of equals, and the fact that politics is now grounded upon religion, for the idea that there is one humanity against biologism, racism, nationalism, and a kind of rationality, but a rationality that has lost its roots, as the great philosopher Edmund Husserl said in his Vienna lecture in 1935. So I deeply, and I think that today the notion of moral education is all important, because we, in Western civilization, we are like brains with food. We do not work on our, there is no psychological and political maturity. We are not equipped. We have not the tools and the moral traits to live like citizens, to be able to institute the common good in a pluralistic society. And so we have a lot of work. And the bad thing is the way we act, the technological ways of interacting sometimes do not help us change our minds, be able to share our negative emotion without repressing them, being able to speak of them and to evolve and so on. So, but there is no acknowledgement of the limits of the planet without the assessment of our limits. And for me, ethics is not abstract, is a way of its self-limitation. But it's not a burden. It's not something that you have, it's not less, it's more. You limit yourself, but you feel more.
Yeah, it's absolutely, you know, therapeutic and psychological what I have heard so far. So thanks a lot. Thank you.
Nikos, are you there? You had a question?
Ο Γιώργος ήθελε να πει κάτι, νομίζω.
Γιώργο, παρακαλώ.
Okay, just 1 minute. Let's forget about Marjorie and Jean Kelevich. I just wanted to ask one question, and I'm afraid that referring to them obscured my question. We have a political problem. We want a transition écologique. Okay, we want a transition to something that can be sustainable and not leaning us towards our collective death. We have to convince people. And as you say, we cannot use only rational arguments. We have to use emotions too. Emotions cannot be left out of the picture. Okay, in my opinion, if we strictly speak of virtue ethics, we are still addressing rational reasons. Okay, we are still addressing reason. How could we address emotions? That was my point. I have, and my question is, if egoism should be thought of as including the freedom of other human beings or other living beings, then maybe our political problem can be helped. I mean, otherwise, I have the feeling the only emotional, so to say, argument we still have is the fear of death. We have to change because in the end we will die altogether. I mean, this is an argument, of course. It's a strong argument, but it's not really a positive argument in a way. That was just the idea.
But when we deal with, for instance, people who change their lifestyles, it's my case because I'm vegan. I'm vegetarian for almost 18 years and vegan for 4 years. So it's a big change in your life, in your daily life. And it's not that easy. So it does not come because you have emotions because you see a video, because there are a lot of people who saw awful videos and they never change. They saw videos, sometimes they cry, but tomorrow they forget. It's not because you think, like Peter Singer, that when you eat meat, you impose excruciating pain to a numerous of beings for pleasure that you could replace. It's not a calculation. This is good on theory, but it does not work in practice. When you change this, when you don't want to be the accomplice of such a system that imposes on animals creating pain every day, every minute, it's because your identity changes from within. You are not the same. It's a shock. You cannot, for me, it happens, I cannot separate my life from the life of animals. That's it. That's it. So I could not take flesh because I can't impose on another being who wants to live. I can't impose on him pain and suffering and so on. So it's not an argument. Of course, you can add argument after to justify, of course. It's not only emotion, it's a part that my identity is not separated from the existence of other beings, and this does not mean that I feel that I'm an animal like the animals. This does not mean that I consider that animals and human beings are the same, but it's and virtue ethics does not mean, in my work, it does not mean that your ways of interacting are driven by arguments, nor by emotions. It's a way of being which has changed. Your freedom, your consideration means that you see the world and you see yourself in a different manner. So you have changed and when you understand that you are not alone, when you feel that you are not alone in your life, your interest, and the word you say, quoting Hannah Arendt, is very strong. Your interest, what you have in you, is not only your pleasure, your fame, and so on. You live for something. This something, for people, it can be their children. For people, it can be the children of their children, or their community. For me, it's a common world, and especially, that's right, animals. So I think that, but what I say does not exclude what you say. Of course, you can also consider that you can. I think that what you say about egoism and altruism is very important to overcome the dead ends, which explain why we could not achieve ecological transition. And a lot of people equate ecological transition with a burden, and they only stress the sacrifice. So nobody wants to make the effort to reduce one's ecological footprint. So you're right. And again, considering fear, Günther Anders said that sometimes we have fear, but we cannot speak with fear. We don't know how to use fear. We are not able to go through fear and to make it, to make fear useful to act. So, of course, emotions and affects, a little bit different, are very important, but the point is to know how to use them. And I think that there are a diversity of moral approaches which can be used. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that virtue ethics, which speaks of ethics as self-transformation, and I try to indicate some steps that we have in common, but everybody does his job. There is no receipt. There is no, nobody can say you have to do and to be this or that. We do no longer live in the world of Aristotle. We do no longer live in the world of Bernard de Clairvaux, in which there were a definition of human being. We, as Sartre said, we are alone and without any excuse. We have to live by ourselves and try to find our way. But I think that the assessment of our limits, the deep understanding of one's carnal condition, and the deep understanding of what ties us with the other living beings is something that helps us grow and be a little bit different and be less dangerous for the others and for the planet. And of course, it does not mean that we will be always virtuous and once for all. This does not exist. There is destructiveness and in human being, and there are also some conditions, some social and affective conditions that prevent some people from growing. Resentment, but also the conditions of work, and the fact that some people lack any social recognition, so they feel that they are nothing, and so they become more than angry, unable to cooperate. So it's not easy, but what I say is that if we do not change at the individual, moral, but deeper than moral, because morality is sometimes a lessons and social codes. But if we don't change, we will not be able to avoid coercion. Coercion, that is to say, a kind of tyranny that leads either to ecological transition or to wars. And I think that we are at a very important age. And when I speak of the age of the living, and Golfo said that there are two paradigms, I think that we live in such a world in which there are a lot of people who express their desire of dominion and all omnipotence. And it is at all the levels of society, and even at the top of some governments, Trump and so on. And some people who want to exert their dominion over nature, over the resources, over animals, and so on. And on the other hand, it is clear that a lot of young people want to change their lives. They don't want to eat like their parents. They don't want to live like their parents. They feel that it is not life. So, and they become more and more interested in the animal cause, which is very strategic. And you know, when I became vegetarian, all my colleagues considered that I was a little bit crazy. Now things have changed, so we have some change, and these changes are the signs of a new age, which articulates the concern for the planet, the concern for the other beings, animals, and the desire to have a life a little bit different, and maybe the taking into account of our earthly and carnal condition. And I think that the fact that vulnerability is a notion that emerges in philosophy from different standpoints, I think it's also a sign, because it has a critical function. And but of course we have to accompany this age, which I call the age of the living, but because nothing is sure, and we live in a very, very dangerous world, and war is possible, war is everywhere, and it's very difficult to achieve some agreements about or disagreements. It's very difficult to achieve some results in the fields which interest me, especially in France. And you know, we do not achieve any, we do not have any results concerning the animal cause, concerning environment is better, but you know, the change that are necessary are very deep, and but we have to accompany them. And what can philosophy could help us maybe change the imaginary in the sense of Castoriadis. That is to say, the meaning of things. The fact that because people have desires in the old world, which is still here, people want to be, they are afraid of dying, so they want to be somebody, they want to have fame, they want money, they want to, there is an addiction of consumption, and there is a void, a moral void, because, and what Hannah Arendt said when she spoke of loneliness, people who have the feeling of being only a force of production and a client, and who have lost the ability to feel that they belong to a community, or who are so lost that they will be tempted, that they will be seduced by too simplistic narratives, such as the narratives of the Nazis or of politics of identity, which are still in all societies. So I think that if we want to avoid the triumphs of the anti-enlightenment, which will lead to wars, to nationalism, and to ecological catastrophe, we have to work a lot and to accompany another age, to speak of what my forthcoming book of new enlightenment, and this enlightenment are not dualistic. And it's true that the feminist issue and standpoint, the animal studies, the people who work on ecology are part of this new age of the living. And of course, if we were living in a great world, we would work together, but we do not live in a great world. So, but we can try to change step by step the imaginary. I think it's very important, because as Castoriadis said, although we have the feeling that we are not free, although we have the feeling that capitalism is there and make us be servants, we institute the common good. We have to deconstruct all these representations, and some of them come from are the core of the Western civilization. So how can we do this work of deconstruction and at the same time show in what can enlighten us, what kind of ancient and classical and modern contemporary thinking can enlighten us today? So
Corine, there are at least two very important themes which you mentioned, which lead us to the presentation by our students, that is Irene and John. First of all, fear, mentioned by George, which leads us to the heuristics of fear in Hans Jonas, and Irene is gonna talk to us about the possible connection between Hans Jonas' philosophy of the living and your own work.